Um, so as we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge, we'll just move the slide, acknowledge that I'm coming to this Zoom on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And acknowledge the work that they've done over thousands of years to protect these lands and waters, and the work that they continue to do that, so that we can all enjoy this incredibly beautiful uh, portion of the world that we live in. Um, and to acknowledge the land itself, I wanted to talk a bit about this waterway here that's really close to my house. It's called Still Creek, and it's in Vancouver. It's close to Renfrew Ravine, which is near the 29th Avenue SkyTrain station. And it's an urban waterway that runs from Burnaby through to East Vancouver and then back into Burnaby Lake, and eventually into the Brunette River, and then finally out to the Salish Sea. And it was buried for a long time under the city, and paved over, and it was, extremely polluted at one point. But there's been, over the past 20 years or so, there's been a lot of effort on the part of the city, and just residents, and Still Moon Arts Society, which is a local arts organization, to restore the creek in really profound ways. And so now it's this incredible oasis that you can go to. It's kind of a hidden gem, just right by the SkyTrain. And I remember watching a talk by the executive director of the Still Moon Arts Society. This was in 2012, and she was saying that, her dream was that the creek would get to a place where the salmon would return to an urban creek, if you can believe it, considering we're in such a dense urban area. And I remember thinking, like, that seems very unlikely. But in 2015, the salmon actually did return. I think it was in 2015, for the first time in nearly 80 years, because of this restoration work that had happened. And then they returned again in 2024. And the restoration of the creek now grows. Now they're installing a wetland in a city park that's really close to my house, and they're doing a lot of work in on the Burnaby side. And so I just love this example, not only because this is the piece of land that I care a lot about and is directly in my vicinity, but also as a metaphor for what I think climate action research and work can do. It can literally daylight creeks in this way and restore some of our ecosystems, but it can also daylight, the capacity within our communities to work together to make the places that we live better, and to restore our relationships with the more than human. So I visit this creek every day. I find it a very deep well of inspiration. And so I hope that people on this call have a place that they can go to, even if it's just a city park or a favorite tree or something, to just really commune with the natural world, and understand what it's, kind of saying to us as we do this work, because I think that we're in relationship with it and in collaboration with it. Um, let's move to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of my own personal motivation for this work. It's super personal for me. So these are my two daughters, Sage and Phoenix. They were both born in extremely smoky conditions in Vancouver, one in 2018 and one in 2021. Phoenix was actually born during the heat dome here in Vancouver on the hottest day on record. So very, obviously very scary. And but I share this story just to reiterate the point, when we're talking about hope and other climate emotions. I think it's really powerful to know what's motivating you when the work gets really hard. And for me, it's a lot of things, but one of the major things that are my kids. And so I think back to that and feel the feelings associated with that, and it's the whole gamut, everything from, like, obviously deep love to fear and anger and sadness, and just feeling all of that together, and then recommitting to the work when it's time to do so. So I think keeping that personal connection in the front of our minds is really important as we do this work, and especially as we talk about feelings like hope. We can move to the next slide. And then just a bit about our work at CERI, at the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU. So we support community engaged research across the university. We focus a lot on graduate students and early career researchers. And so we have several programs that we have our graduate fellowship program where we teach and build community around community engaged research at the university with grad students. We also have our research shop where we hire grad students to work with community organizations to provide research services at low or no cost to those organizations. And then we're also on several different research projects, and then we do workshops like this quarterly. We'll just move to the next slide. And then we do quite a bit of community engaged climate work as well. So these are just some of the projects that we've done. Um, uh, related to climate, so supporting nonprofits in the downtown east side. We're actually located in the downtown east side with our climate resiliency roadmap. We've done some climate communications and journalism work with Quiet Alarm and covering climate elections. And then our grad student, actually Megan Mattis, did an amazing project with the Climate Reality Project that looked at advancing climate action through participatory democracy. So just a bit of our work there, and we're really interested in this intersection of obviously of community engaged research and climate, or what we call climate action research. Um, I already mentioned the series, but just to bring it up again, so we're at workshop 2, and then we'll be doing our next workshop on May 27th on equity, diversity, and inclusion in climate action, hosted by the Climate Hub, and then we'll top off the series with climate communications for researchers on June 16th, and I'll be facilitating that one. Okay, so I just wanted to do a check-in with folks. I think I was gonna make a kind of a game time decision based on how many people are in the room, and we've got 19, so I think I was gonna, if there was a smaller group, go around in a circle, but I think because we're a bit of a bigger group, um, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. One second. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is the session outline. So we're gonna do our check-in. I'm gonna give I'm going to like facilitate a discussion on critical hope and climate action based on a paper my colleague and I wrote. It'll be brief, and there's going to be some interactive discussion throughout that just to kind of ground us in the subject matter. Then we're going to explore some case studies and then do an activity related to either those case studies or your own climate work that you're up to. Uh, we're going to move on to another sort of question. So we're talking about hope today, but hope is one emotion on a spectrum of emotions that can arise when we're working in climate, on climate change or in climate action research. And I wanted to bring up this wheel. Some people may have seen it already, the climate emotions wheel. Panu Pikkulala is from the University of Helsinki, and he's developed a lot of really interesting work on climate emotions, and one of them is this wheel. And he also has a podcast on this topic that's quite good. Um, and I just find it helpful to understand that all of these feelings are present, depending on the day, depending on the situation, depending on the project, and we're moving between them all the time. And it's just helpful to know that like climate emotions, just like the weather, come and go and change, and that's okay. And I think it's a core competency in climate research to understand how to work with them. Um, and so I wanted to just see what like where folks are at in terms of what emotion best describes how they feel about climate change right now. And so I just want to, as you think about this question, maybe we'll just breathe together for a minute. So if you could just close your eyes um, and just take one breath in and out. And then we'll just do one more. And as your eyes are closed, um, I just pay attention to what emotion comes up when you think about how you feel about climate change right now, today. And just reflect on that. And then if you want to share it in the chat, we could get a sense of where people are at today. Also, feel free to just speak it into the room if that's more resonant for you. Sense of loss, but also hope, overwhelm, empathy, overwhelm, powerlessness, and empathy. That resonates. Worry and guilt, sadness, loss, curiosity, and hope. So a lot of like holding two things at once, which feels very resonant for me as well. A mix of overwhelm and hope. Curiosity isn't on there. Yeah. Curiosity is a good one. Um, yeah, so there's the spectrum. I feel like some of the comments are reflecting the diversity of feelings that we can have. And just I just want to reflect and validate that this work is incredibly difficult, to state the obvious. Um, the magnitude of the problem, the slow pace of progress, the disproportionate consequences facing systemically marginalized communities, the existential weight of what we're facing, and the isolation in our grief that can sometimes happen when we work alone and live in a very individualistic society where a lot of our community supports have broken down. So this work is really, really hard. And I just want to name that. And I think the reason why I wanted to spend some time here on the emotions is because it's really important, I've found in my work, um, to validate what we're feeling. So when we're feeling things like grief or anger and anxiety, to know that those are rational responses to ecological and social loss. So ignoring, and when you ignore them, it can alienate you from your own work. And if you don't tend to those emotions, they're going to show up anyways. And they're going to show up in ways that might be counterproductive to what you're trying to do and counterproductive to the relationships you're trying to build. So I think it's really important to uh, to understand that. And then they also signal the value, where our values lie, and that there is harm occurring. So they can sharpen our analysis and our ethical clarity, like just that sense of this is wrong. And I want to make it right, or I want to do things in a good way, in a way that, is different from how they've been done in the past. Those are emotional signals that are very informative for how we move forward. And then I think they're also, when they're named, and especially when they're held collectively, they can be transformed into motivation for action. So, and when they're not addressed, they can lead, I think, to disengagement and burnout. I know that can be very true for me if I don't address what I'm feeling through meditation or through a walk or through art making, whatever your thing might be. I can just get very disengaged and burnt out with it, because it is just so much at once. So, and I also want to say naming positive emotions is also super important. So this work can be incredibly meaningful, and can be very joyful at the same time. And that's also important to recognize that. Well, I mean, people said that in the chat, that you're often holding both. And so recognizing that spectrum and that movement between the two or between the two, polarities, I guess you could say, or the quadrants, maybe might be more accurate, is really helpful to keep in mind. Okay, so we can move on. So part of what I wanted to talk about today is what my colleague Kari Grain and I wrote up in an article for the Canadian Journal on Action Research. And It was titled Not All Hope is Created Equal, Climate Action Research as a Source of Critical Hope. And we examined the 7 principles of critical hope that Kari detailed in her book of the same title. And we applied them to climate action research projects to really flesh out the concept, well, both concepts, the concept of critical hope in a climate context, and also the idea of climate action research and how we were defining that in the work that we're seeing both in our office and in our other research work. So we drew on examples from both inside and outside the academy to explore how climate action research contributes to the communication and cultivation of what we call critical climate hope. We can move to the next slide. So often there's this kind of polarity between hope versus doom, I guess, or positive versus negative ways of thinking about the climate crisis. And the good news stories can be criticized. This is on Climate Week and Toxic Positivity by Amy Westerfeld, who's an incredible investigative climate journalist. And she was just sort of reflecting on at Climate Week, I think this was in 2025, um, just the toxic positivity of the focus on the heavy focus on solutions, and we can do this, and and it's not too late, and all, and those kinds of messages, and then big emphasis on clean tech, and there are these technical solutions that are amazing, um all that is true, I think to an extent, but then she felt that, in these spaces, there was this perpetuation of unrealistic expectations and an avoidance of interrogating the root causes, or worse, like ignorance of the enormity of the power relations that are at play with the fossil fuel industry and now, the presidency, and just like, yes, it's important to focus on solutions, and there is this like the largest industry that's ever existed on Earth is like what we're trying to confront. And they are manipulating, they've been telling lies about climate change since they found out about it in the late 60s, early 70s, and they continue to do that today to the point where they're like shaking the foundations of what truth actually is. And so we can't ignore that. And I think she was just expressing a frustration of some of that sort of um, toxic positivity that can exist within the climate movement. At the same time, at the same time, climate doomerism is also not productive, to just think that there's nothing, and it can be easy to fall into this, and I've done it many times, but to think that there is nothing we can do, or that it's too late, or that whatever you might do makes no difference, or the power structure is never going to change in any meaningful way in my lifetime, things like that. Um, that is also very corrosive, right? And there's been studies that show that, especially for younger folks, that Grace Nosek, who's in the room in Toronto, work reminds me of this, of like the fossil fuel industry on purpose seeds doom in younger generations, because if they think that nothing can change, they won't get involved. It's corrosive to engagement. So that's also not helpful. So the binary is both like not true, and but also like where a lot of the discourse can lie sometimes. And I think this is why we need like a robust frameworks of critical hope to understand like the nuances of these feelings, and also the practicalities of how they can inform and show up in our work. Okay, we can go to the next slide. In the paper, we do just like a very short literature review on discourses of climate hope. Almost all of it is written by women that we cite. We didn't do an exhaustive list, but and so what you kind of see, so there's Joanna Macy, defines hope as a practice rooted in acknowledging the crisis and understanding our roles and taking deliberate steps to systemic change. Rebecca Solnit sees it as, hope is an active political stance that resists despair and fuels collective action by drawing on historical movements. So looking at what people have done in the past when they've faced huge societal problems like this. Ellen Kelsey amplifies in her book, Hope Matters, looks at the changes that have happened with respect to climate and that are happening in like ecological restoration and decarbonization, and so looking at just what we have done and that being a sense of hope and what we can do. Of course, Adrienne Maree Brown's emergent strategy, looking at biomimicry and looking to nature and the way nature adapts as in small relational and intentional actions and how we could mirror that as human beings. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson describes in What If We Get It Right? Hope is a vision building exercise where imagining a better climate future can make grounded, tangible actions possible. Naomi Klein, argues that hope emerges from organized structural transformation, so from community organizing and political movements. Winona Duke, in her book, roots hope in Indigenous sovereignty and deep relationships with land and water. So these relationships animate a powerful resistance to the extractive industry and ecological violence. Jonathan Lear's notion of radical hope speaks to the strength found in imagining new futures amid and beyond cultural collapse. So from an Indigenous point of view, knowing that it's often said Indigenous people have already experienced many apocalypses, and survived through it, and their culture has evolved to continue to survive. And so he draws hope from ancestral knowledge and creating new ways of being in response to collapse. So this just gives you a taste of the diverse expressions that reveal hope in the climate movement. And it's not a static or singular concept. It's being articulated in different ways, and it's evolving as our relationship with hope and climate also evolves. And then one thing that I think runs through all of these is that hope is a practice. It's something that you do. It's not like a feeling that you magically have. It's you act even when you aren't hopeful, and by acting, you gain hope. And also the collective aspect of it. So it's a collective force that draws on imagination and community and emotion and struggle. Um, so I guess the main sort of takeaway is that hope. I've been convinced through by reading deep into this topic that it's critical, and it's critical in rejecting complacency and fueling transformation. We have to have a source of hope, and we have to, in order to do that, I think we have to understand how hope actually works as an emotion and how we cultivate it within ourselves. Um, Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. So I'm curious, where does hope show up in your field, and how is it usually framed in your research? How do folks talk about hope? Like, is it something that's explicitly talked about? Is there cynicism when it comes to the word hope or the idea of hope? Does it show up in like physical manifestations, like in restoring a creek, or maybe it shows up in a relationship? So I'm curious how that might show up for folks. And feel free to share in the chat, or also like raise your hand if you want to speak into the room. I'm wondering, in with the group in Toronto, if you all have any reflections on this question.
You're unmuted now. Okay. Hey, can I speak, Tara?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, this is Grace mentioned. My research is in part about young people and the fossil fuel industry. And yeah, part of the reason that I do this interdisciplinary work is because there wasn't a lot of space for hope in law. I studied fossil fuel industry misinformation and democracy, and then I saw that apathy is really where they want us to land. And so I think for us at the University of Toronto Climate Hub, working with young people is really where the hope shows up. And the discourse, you're right, is so important. It's so polarized. And when you get into a classroom with high school kids, like they don't have hope. Like it's just a totally different generational group, like how what they've been raised with as the image and the story and for how long. And so yeah, that really working with young people, I think is where the hope shows up and kind of yeah, I just gave two talks in high schools, and some of the feedback was like, no one's ever told us there's still a chance for 15-year-olds. So yeah, we gotta be we gotta be giving the really young kids critical hope.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. Yeah, that is, yeah, that makes me feel really devastated that kids would feel that way at 15. And to your point, yeah, even more motivation to find that in ourselves, to be those role models, to find how we navigate feelings of hopelessness for our kids, because they're watching us.
And just to add, not to leave it on a note of devastation, because it was an incredibly joyful conversation that I had with these young people. Like we left it whooping and cheering, and I find the apathy and cynicism is shallow. It's intense but shallow, and if I challenge it, they're so ready to have hope and think about their future. So to me, it's so exciting. There is so much to do with high school and university students, and they're because so few folks have engaged with them in this way. It's just like a huge possibility of getting in there and being kind of the first person to talk to young people in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point that it's shallow. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think you're right. And I mean, having been in a room with you in many different occasions, that's really your gift is to like bring the hope forward and make it contagious. And it's true. It is, you can change that energy, quite, I don't want to say easily, but I think it's with intention, you can flip it in a room, and I think that's yeah, kind of I'm going to get to that a bit of how we do that in our research. Um, Romilla in the chat says, in this work, I feel hope emerges through the holism of being queer and connected to faith-based ways. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think I mean, faith is an interesting and I think a really important well of energy that can help serve us in our quest to sort of cultivate hope within ourselves. And then, yeah, also feeling whole as a person, I think is a huge part of that. Miranda, I see your comment in the chat. Did you want to speak to that aloud, or do you want me to read out what you said?
I think it's fine. I think I explained things. Elodie has her hand up, so
Oh,
folks can read
right
that.
on.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for doing this, Tara. Um, Hope is a strange word. I'm in the political science department, so obviously it's not necessarily a very hopeful field. But I work with communities that are negotiating about climate in international forums and are contesting certain things and borders, sovereignty, all sorts of discussions. And what I'm noticing is a lot of these communities have been through colonialism before, and they will share that, this is yet another emergency we have to deal with. And the interesting part with it is I think there is almost a call that you cannot not be hopeful. You have a responsibility to future generations and the work that these communities do to reclaim land and to enter into what I would call resurgence practices is hopeful in the sense that, we don't have a choice. If we're not hopeful, then we might as well just roll over and die. And we've chosen not to do that ever since we've been through the horrors of colonialism. So how do we continue to practice these resurgent practices? And they may not be called hope, but I think there's something very immensely hopeful about them.
Yes, thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, that sort of resilience that comes from survivism, of just getting through it. I'm curious what if you were to, is there like another word that you think is more accurate? I mean, you're saying resurgence, maybe that's the word, but because I think that sometimes the word hope, like it triggers just because the cultural baggage it has in English and in the Western world. And I'm always like, what's a better word? But then there's not a lot out there.
Well, one of the women that I've been talking to and working with for my research, she called it new communal ways of living. And she was talking about, well, we're in this mess right now. What other choices do we have? We need to invent new ways of living. And I think there's a lot of Indigenous scholars who also talk about communal ways of living. Again, that comes back to resurgence. So it's more of an exercise in reimagining systems rather than just, despairing at the one that we have. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Thank you for that. Um, okay, we're gonna move on. So we'll move to the next slide. So the two key ideas I want folks to leave with today are critical hope, which we're going to get into. There's the more details around it, and this idea of climate action research as we sort of talk about it in the paper and how we're practicing it in our office. So we'll move to the next slide. So what is critical hope? That's the book. That's Kari's book, and that's Kari down there. She's on mat leave right now. She just had her first baby about a couple months ago, so she's enjoying that stage of life, which yeah, I feel like is bringing new life into the world is probably one of the most hopeful things that you can do as a human being. So I'm glad that she's experiencing that right now. So I'll just move to the next slide. And so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, but just to give you a sense of what Kari sort of talks about in the book and how she sort of sets up the framework. So it's really based around these 7 principles. So the first one is hope is necessary but not enough. So the idea that on its own, hope risks like having little pragmatic impact if it lacks intimate partnership with critical self-reflection and a commitment to actionable change. So it's got to be rooted in self-reflection, criticality, and action. Hope is not something you have, it's something you practice. So we talked about this already. Kari talks about this idea of relentless incrementalism. So over time, with an eye to shifting context and iteration, you just keep doing the work. And over time, as we can see, looking at other movements, change does happen, but it can take time. I'm going to do this work for the rest of my life, and my kids are probably going to be doing this work. And it's like building a cathedral, like it's going to be many generations of work. I heard one Indigenous scholar talk about like the 1,000 years of repair. This is like so just knowing that like you're doing your part every day relentlessly, and it will add up and it will make a difference. Number 3, hope is messy, uncomfortable, and full of contradictions. So just sitting in that discomfort of the contradictions that climate action is, right? One tension that comes up a lot for us in our office is this tension between like urgency and justice. And so on one hand, you have the climate crisis is a ticking clock. It demands fast, large-scale responses like rapid decarbonization, aggressive policy shifts, and the fast deployment of green technologies. On the other hand, climate justice requires like very slow, relational, trust-based, often localized processes that prioritize equity and inclusion and the leadership of those most affected. And those can be in direct conflict with each other. And so it doesn't mean that you prioritize one over the other necessarily. It's context dependent. And you also have to hold that they are in tension with each other. And so so it's about like resisting the binary thinking and recognizing that most effective climate solutions must balance urgency with care. So just naming that sort of complexity. Number four, critical hope is intimately entangled with the body and the land. So we talked about the land already today. And I think human beings draw immense peace from the land, meaning, it sustains us physically and spiritually, and as does the body, understanding our emotions and how our body is connected to the land and what's going on around us. And so bringing in these embodied ways of knowing and land-based connection to knowledge is super important to this work. Number five, critical hope requires bearing witness to social and historical traumas. So bearing witness is relational, and it can nourish connections and build community and reinforce the power of storytelling. So people speaking their truth, right, is a big part of healing. And so as a community, being, listening, being a place where of witnessing the pain that people are going through and will go through because of climate change. We have to bear witness and support each other through that pain. And that's part of what builds our resilience and our critical hope. Number six, hope requires interruptions and invitations. So this is about interrupting like the practices that might harm the movement, the climate, the earth, while simultaneously creating invitations to as many people as possible to be involved. So it's like stopping and starting. So we want to stop this, but we're also building something else that's replacing that's better. So that it can't just be no, Naomi Klein talks about like no is not enough. We have to be building the thing that we're criticizing as we're criticizing it. I think academia sometimes falls into this trap of criticality, and you criticize everything, you look for the holes in everyone's argument, and then and then it ends there. And then there's always like one little paragraph at the end of a paper that's like, oh yeah, we should like maybe explore what a new thing might be. And I think that should be flipped. Like one paragraph should be, these are the problems, we all know what they are, like they've been around for a long time, and then here's all the things that people are doing to address those problems. And it doesn't mean that we can't be critical or self-reflective of those, but like it's about where is our energy going and where is our focus going. Um, and then I think when we're talking about invitations, looking at like specifically creating invitations for two, I think we talk about this in the paper, but two broad populations. So one, who are the systemically marginalized due to the reasons of socioeconomic, race, class, and gender. So focusing on those folks, like how do we create research and projects and policies that specifically address those groups. And then also people who orientate themselves to conservative worldviews or that tend to deny or resist the goals of the climate movement. I think this constituency is also very important. It's tricky because, a lot of climate engagement sort of theory says like, don't waste your time on people who are denying the issue, like work with the people who can be moved, which I think is true. And but there's also the climate movement has been kind of siloed as like a left issue. And so how do we talk about it in different and new ways that address the needs people have around, like a fair transition and what they might do if, fossil fuel workers, for example, or people who, grew up in just conservative places in the country. We can't just discard those people as if their background and their views don't matter. And of course they care about climate change, right? Of course they care about clean water and clean air, but there's something that's happened in the discourse that makes them pull away from the movement. And I think we have to figure out ways to create on-ramps for those people. Number seven, this is the last one. Anger and grief have a seat at the table. So I already talked about this quite a bit, but there can be no meaningful conversation about the climate crisis unless it engages deeply with emotions such as anger and grief. And dealing with those emotions is how we build our resiliency and our capacity for critical hope. Okay, so that's the key concept, and then the first key concept, and then the second one is this idea of climate action research. Um, and I know this has probably been defined in other ways, in other places, but for us, in this paper, we define it in the following ways. So, just move to the next one. So it's basically climate action plus action research. So, bringing together the effort taken by individuals, governments, and organizations to reduce greenhouse gases and adapt to climate change, and promote environmental justice and sustainability, mixed with climate action research, which is an iterative process that brings together researchers and community members to, define the issues and reflect on the actions that are needed, et cetera. So then we define climate action research. We actually define it as a form of community organizing, rather than an approach to research that uses research to achieve outcomes determined by the communities involved. So yeah, I really see it as a community organizing dynamic as opposed to a research dynamic. And then, so in this context, like research becomes a catalyst, not only for data, but for activating relationships, expanding agency, and connecting lived experience, to things like policy influence or other changes in the community that, that are reflective of climate action. And research projects can reflect visible progress that counters the widespread climate doomerism fueled by abstract, large-scale narratives of crisis. So I think, when we work locally, and with community on climate projects, it becomes really tangible and relationship based. And then that is where you can find hope. When you're talking about, the IPCC report or global emissions or, all of the very depressing news that can come out when you zoom out, that if you focus there, in my opinion, for too long, it's just a recipe for despair. Um, where you find hope is on the local level. So how are communities getting together to restore a creek or to, change the transportation mechanisms that they get their kids to school with so that they can lower their emissions. Like this is how it becomes real for people, and this is where it becomes hopeful because you can get small wins, right? You can convince the principal at your kid's school to do a slow streets program in front of their school so people are doing more active transportation to get their kids to school. Of course, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's a cultural shift. Like I just use that example because that's what's happening at my kid's school. But I now when I go past other schools in the city, you see like almost all of the schools have school streets in front of them. And then that movement can move to another city, right? And it can domino from there. So I think there can be momentum that happens at the local level that's can be really inspiring. And then just lastly on this, the knowledge mobilization strategies can generate joy and connection, especially when they take up creative formats like art or music, or connecting to land and place. So in getting the knowledge out of the research that you're doing, that can create opportunities for critical hope. And we'll move to the next slide. The other crucial part is that climate action research is guided by a theory of change. So a theory of change is just the idea that like, if we do X, then Y will happen, will happen. And excuse me, I'm just gonna get some water. And I'm still surprised at how many research projects don't have theories of change. So it's just like, we're gonna do this research and then that's it. Like it ends there. Like but it's like like for what purpose? Like where will the research go after you do it? And who is the audience for the research beyond just like 10 other academics? Like thinking through like what are the steps? Like who are the decision makers that if they read your research would be influenced by it? And like all those kinds of questions that community organizers or like political campaigns or environmental campaigns, they like think through researchers don't always do that, and I think that they should. It should be part of their work, even if they're not the ones that are going to go and do the change. I think there's got to be some theory of change that's articulated in their research so that folks understand, like, oh, like this research on, like water quality in this creek or whatever it might be could lead to X, which could lead to X, which could better this situation for the communities that are around it. Something like that, I think should be like a standard practice and in this type of research. Um, and then we'll just move to the next slide. And then it's community engaged research strengthens solidarity. So it builds community capacity and the foundation for long-term transformation by centering the relationships. So I think this part's really important because it's like, even if you don't quote unquote win whatever it is that you're working on, it's still beneficial to have built the relationships, and then to explore what solidarity might look like across class, race, gender, which I think research projects can help to do. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. So this is in our paper. This is just like a helpful little diagram, or just little table, I guess, to see the 7 principles and then to key considerations for your research. So key questions to ask yourself when you're doing this kind of research about how critical hope kind of relates to what you're doing. So I find this to be really helpful in making decisions about who you engage with, how you engage with them, how you show up, what ways of knowing you're using, how you're tending to your own emotions related to the project, things like that. So we'll move on. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of case studies that that sort of bring to life how this way of doing research shows up in the world. So we'll move to the next slide. So the first example is the RELAW project done by West Coast Environmental Law. So RELAW stands for Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water. And so this is a partnership between West Coast Environmental Law and the Indigenous Law Research Unit at UVic. And it works with Indigenous communities to revitalize and apply traditional legal systems to environmental governance. Such an incredible organization and program. And so through community-led research and legal co-development, they support the creation of governance frameworks where the knowledge holders develop Indigenous-led like approaches to governance. So for example, like in a it's often used in fisheries governance, where research is used to, community engaged research is used to clarify the traditional laws that have governed the land, write them down, and then use them in legal arguments to then gain more rights for the Indigenous communities involved so that they can then make the decisions related to in the fishery or land use, or so then those natural resources are then governed by Indigenous law. So, but in order to get there, you have to do the community engaged research. And that work is very, what's the word? Like, you have to, the stories that folks often share related to Indigenous law are like really important stories for the community and the culture, and they don't share them. And there has to be trust built there in order to share them, because historically those stories and their culture has been used against them by settlers to undermine their governance, right? So they can be very reluctant to share those stories. And so being really careful about how this engagement happens is really important. But as a model for climate engaged research, it centers Indigenous sovereignty and community priorities. It treats research as a relationship and as a capacity building exercise with the community. And then it drives real world policy and governance change. So there's real world impacts coming from this project that are directly related to how the climate action research is unfolding. And then how it relates to critical hope, it confronts the erasure of Indigenous legal systems while supporting communities to actively rebuild and live these laws into the present. This work is relational and place-based. It's rooted in responsibilities to land and future generations. And it holds truth and possibility at once, bearing witness to colonial harm, while creating pathways towards decolonial, life-affirming futures. Okay, so we'll move to the next example. So this is the Climate Disaster Project. It's an international oral history and teaching newsroom based out of the University of Victoria that documents the lived experiences of climate disasters through trauma-informed and co-created storytelling. So it works with survivors of floods, wildfires, and heat events to produce testimonies and investigative stories that are shared through journalism, theater, exhibitions, and policy forums. This project is quite large and it spans over several countries. They're currently working on an exhibition in at the Human Rights Museum, and then it's going to move to the ROM in Toronto. They did a theater project that was what's a verbatim theater. So they took the testimonies of survivors, the direct quotes, and then created this theater production of different climate disaster, like little vignettes. It was quite powerful. I went and saw it last summer. And so they're really kind of changing or like deepening the narrative, I guess, of like the impacts of climate on folks, and then bringing policymakers into the conversation so that policymakers understand these impacts better so that they can better make decisions that support survivors. So the way that this is connected to critical hope is by turning grief into and lived experience into action through the different mechanisms I talked about. It creates space to bear witness to emotional and social impacts of climate disaster while linking these stories to policy change and collective response. And it centers relational, community-rooted storytelling. So it shows how hope can emerge through truth-telling, shared understanding, and mobilization of lived experiences. So truth-telling can be quite empowering. It's sort of counterproductive if you tell a difficult story, that it actually makes you more hopeful. But I think it's because it can lift that weight off of you, and the story of trauma can be held collectively. And I think that can allow you to then move on, and cultivate more hope in your life, having shared that with people who can hold it with you. Yeah, and then we'll move to the third case study. Oh yeah, we can skip this one. And this is the last one, Quiet Alarm. So this was a project we did out of our office, which was a review of the CBC's climate reporting. So we worked with the Climate Emergency Unit to evaluate the climate journalism at the CBC, but we worked with journalists specifically. So these were people who either were freelance journalists or who had previously worked at the CBC, and they guided the project and they made suggestions on how to go about engaging with other journalists and how to provide recommendations that would be relevant to the community of journalists. And so they were sort of like our co-researchers. And then it also had a strong advocacy component. So we were quite actively engaging with the CBC itself. So the head of news, we sent outreach to like the upper echelons, like the president and stuff like that. We didn't get a response, but we were actively engaging the different producers for the different flagship news shows, things like that, to really have this advocacy piece built into the knowledge mobilization. And this really gets at that like research as community organizing piece. So we were really focused on accountability, like we're watching you. We see what you're doing with really bad news climate coverage, and shifting the narrative around that, and also like empowering journalists. We often heard that journalists would bring our report to meetings with their producers to advocate for better climate reporting. So we kind of gave them a tool which they could use in their spheres of influence to change how climate reporting was done. So this embodies critical hope by that sort of invitation and interruption I talked about. So pairing critique with constructive pathways for change. And rather than positioning journalists as adversaries, we created a collaborative space for them to and invited them into the project. So we were really careful to not critique journalists. That was not the point. Or to critique their stories. It was to talk about this larger system at play. And then with the data, I forgot to mention that we engaged 30 volunteers to monitor the shows. So we engaged people to collect the data as well. And what the data show, we just showed them the data, and it wasn't a critique. It was like, here's the data and help us make it better. We know you're doing your best, you know. And then we were really conscious of pointing out where there was really good journalism happening, because there is good journalism happening in a lot of different places at the CBC. It's just not being highlighted. They're not leading with that. And so that was really important for the relationship building part of it. Okay, so we're gonna move to the next slide. Oh, that's just a bit more on Quiet Alarm. We did this was a knowledge mobilization piece I'll just mention quickly, where we made podcasts as if the CBC had listened to all of our recommendations. So we're like, this is what a radio show would sound like if you listened to us. And then Seth Klein and Angelina Papadurai and Zaya Tong, they pretended sort of like they were the CBC morning show, and it was great. Like, they talked about the air quality. Like, you know, we said in our report, you know, we hear the business news, what, 7, 8 times a day. It comes on Syndicate, but we don't hear, like, what is the local air quality where you're living, so you can know whether you should bike to work or not. Like, we should be hearing that every hour. You know, what is the status of uh Canada's commitment to our climate goals? That should be like the business news. Like, what progress are we making on that? And so they sort of modeled that in this 3-part podcast series that we did. So there's just a fun way to kind of take the research one step further and articulate what it could look like. Okay, we'll just move to the next. I was thinking for the last few minutes here, we could just have just a bit of open discussion around what you talked about in your great breakout rooms, and just like any kind of reflections on what was shared in the workshop, and how, you know, how this idea of hope is like either coming up or not coming up in your work, and how you think you might bring it in. Anybody want to jump in? Laura, I'm curious to hear from you folks in Toronto.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. We were talking about one project that Neil and I are working on, thinking about how with a Toronto Environmental Alliance, so the kind of local environmental organization, about how community hubs can lead climate action in their communities. They're already doing so much community capacity building and frontline services, and climate is so much integrated in that. And so the hubs themselves got together and are thinking about trying to advance this work. And so we have a kind of supporting research project for that, a scan, a review, and a case study of one in particular. And one thing that we were talking about in our breakout was how much hope we feel from working with community centers who are getting it done. No, like no matter what, they've got to help their community. They find a way to do it. They figure out something that kind of adds a climate component. They have big plans and dreams that they would do if they could find the support for it, and they build towards that. But how much hope comes from working with partners who are trying to do the thing, build the plane as we fly. And then we talked about how much there would be more support from more critical hope if there was more connection between them, because sometimes they're islands doing their own thing in their own neighborhood or their own community that they serve. And so we thought about that kind of relationship building on another level, place to place.
Interesting. Yeah, that really resonates with the climate resilience roadmap project we're working on the Downtown East Side, we're working with 4 social service organizations, and they said the exact same thing, which was we're all trying to piece together some climate work, separate it alone, right? And we do like in our various organizations, and they want to work together, but they just don't have the capacity to build those connections. And one thing, so in listening and working with them, one thing we were able to do is hire a research organizer, as we like to call them. And that researcher's work, that grad student's work is, she spends most of her time just connecting the organizations. So and so is working on this. I know you're working on it too. Like they're doing shade canopies and DIY misting stations. And I know you did a misting station last year and they want to do one this year. And like, let's meet on, like, just all that work of it just falls through the cracks because it's not in any one person's job description. I feel like that's a place where researchers can really add value. That's really cool though.
And the organizer.
You wanna jump in?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say that I love the idea of community organizing first and research second, and this piece of it of like creating, like using that capacity. It's just the best. We have such a space, such an ability to be the connective tissue at universities and to take resources and push them outwards. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else? Ryan, Keegan, Reddy, Elodie, your hand is up.
I just wanted to put my hands up to Ramilla, who shared their wonderful work with CCMS and what they were thinking about in terms of integrating climate. But I think one of the pieces that came out really strongly in our conversation was the principle around embodiment and the entanglement of body and land, and trying to think of practices that we can bring in our work in terms of bringing that land back into how we engage or how we work with participants in the research or in community work. And that sometimes a lot of us have to do some of this work on Zoom, and it can be a little bit hard to bring back the land. So we were both thinking of that beautiful picture of Still Creek you posted, and even trying to think of, what small elements of land and even embodiment with that land can be brought back. And I think that's often missing in a lot of our fields.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if either of you have like practices that you use, whether it's on Zoom or in person, that help to facilitate that.
Yeah, I have a practice that comes from Carolyn Roberts' book, Restoring Education, which I guess encourages folks to gather even in an online setting through circle work is what it's called. So just going around, and I think we were about to do that, except for the sheer size of our group, but making sure that my cohorts are small or intimate, I should say, so that we have the time to go around in a circle and kind of do that sharing. I was sharing with Elodie that we've done the work before of sharing our neighborhoods and our lands, but bringing in the photo, bringing in the visual is that added element. And what kind of inquiries can we introduce within the circle that will allow participants to go out in the world and continue that relationality with the land, is a question that I have. But yeah, this workshop has been so great in starting those gears turning and getting some ideas.
Thank you. Yeah, the circle is so, I was so torn to do it or not do it. We're just on the cusp of like too many people. But yeah, I agree. It's such a good default to have in a room of just like hearing the voices of every person, like every person getting just a little bit of time, even if they don't want to speak much during the workshop, just to hear every voice. I love that as like just a baseline facilitation technique.
And one thing I've done that has worked in person, and so I'm trying to figure out how we translate this online. We go for walks and we do dialogues during walks on the land. And I did one when I was in Brazil this past year with some indigenous folks from Brazil, and it was wonderful because they have these downpours of rain that are very random in the afternoon. And we decided we would just walk in the rain all together. And it was very embodied, like feeling the rain and talking about climate and the changes that also it brings to rain and water. So it was very tangible in the body, that particular walk. So maybe even thinking about how can we invite participants in a Zoom session to bring elements from the outside. Could you bring in a leaf or, some water that you've collected the night before, whatever it is, and then kind of share it. I don't know, but that's same as Ramilla. I have gears running.
Hmm. I love walking. I love that idea, by the way, of like bringing in an element from nature into a Zoom meeting, and the walking methodology is so great. I love how when you're walking, especially with other people, but even on your own, like it helps you think differently. Like your body's thinking with you, right? So the blood is pumping in different ways, and so you're getting different ideas. And it made me think of an idea of maybe like, intentionally having a Zoom where everyone just walk, like you just say, we're all tuning in on our phones and we're going to walk our own neighborhoods, and you facilitate it that way, just as an audio kind of like facilitation, and people can talk as they're walking or something like that. Um, we worked on a project called Walk With Me, that worked with folks surviving the drug poisoning crisis in small towns in BC, and they used walking as a way to process grief associated with the issue, and so powerful. And they actually had the circle too. They for every before and after every walk, they would do an opening circle and a closing circle, and then on the walk you would listen to audio stories of folks who were from that neighborhood struggling with the issue, and had either overcome it or were still struggling with it, or a family member was struggling with it. And so as you're listening to the stories, you're processing through your body with other people um the situation, and then you go back to the circle and you talk as a group. It was just like so beautiful, and like such a nice way to incorporate all of that in a different way of processing. So thank you, Elodie. And Romilla. Appreciate those reflections. Anyone else want to share? Maybe we got time for a couple more. Anything coming up for you, Miranda?
Oh, Rhea had a really good example of hope in her home community, but I'm kind of putting her on the spot.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Hey.
Awesome. No, that's okay. Thank you, Miranda. I was just talking about how my time in the graduate liberal studies program at SFU, I ended up writing an autobiographical fiction essay on sort of the gentrification of my hometown back in India. It's a city called Dehradun, which has a really long um, long-standing culture of being one with the environment and with the trees specifically. It's a very green city, and it was a very small city. It wasn't meant to hold the population that it does right now. And we were sort of riffing on the irony of the fact that builders and developers have sort of come in to create sort of a marketing strategy based on how green the city is and how beautiful it is and how one with nature the people are, only to then strip it all down and sort of make space for people to come in and enjoy the greenery while actively ruining it. And it's been very despairing just being in my hometown and watching the changes happen over the last 20 years or so. And it's been very scary. But at the same time, we've also seen great developments just in people uh, gathering. And that does give me a sense of hope because people have been gathering. And there've been protests around trees that have been sort of like massive waves of deforestation to widen streets and create more room for buildings and things like that. And there was a big transplantation project that was sort of initiated, but the survival rate of those trees and just the flora in general hasn't been great, and people are demanding answers. People are protesting. They're gathering. People are taking action, and that really, really is something to see. It's also interesting because there is a parallel wave of doomerism even amongst my friends and people I know personally, and at the same time there are people who are actively making efforts. So that's really hopeful, and it's good to see. And also I was sharing with Miranda that workshops like this give me hope because people are doing the work and we are actively having conversations, even though when I was looking at the feelings wheel, I was overwhelmingly feeling powerless. And it's just an emotion that I'm sure all of us deal with quite a bit. But yeah, it's gathering and solidarity, even in that, is something that I find a lot of hope in. But yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Yeah, it's that frustrating contradiction of like you live in a beautiful place and then everybody else wants to live there and comes there and makes it not as beautiful of a place anymore. But yeah, as you say, I mean, I also feel like it's also an opportunity for the community to like articulate what they think the future of that place could be, like um if the growth is going to happen regardless, it's like, can the culture of that place be infused in the way that it changes is one sort of like way of thinking about it. But yeah, it's so hard. And also, yeah, hopeful at the same time. And just it's for me, it's like it really comes down to being together. Like it's all about community and just like sharing space with people who also care about the thing and thinking together and doing together. Um, so maybe unless there's any last reflections. Thank you, Rhea, for sharing that. I really appreciated that contribution and your reflections on the workshop. Just wanted to say that. If there's yeah, maybe just one last call if there's any last sort of like anything folks wanted to share about the breakout rooms or what they might think about doing going forward. Just open up the space for a minute. Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you everybody for participating and for coming to this. It was really great for me to deliver this work we've been working on for a long time, and this is the first time I'm kind of talking about it publicly. So I really appreciated your time and attention to it. And yeah, please come to our subsequent workshops in the coming months. And thank you to Laura and the U of T team for collaborating with us on this workshop and getting the momentum going around it. So yeah, we'll see you all soon.